everybody. Welcome back to the Music Buds podcast. This is episode number 45, and my name is Henry. This week, I'm honored to be joined by composer Maclaine Diemer, known partly for his work on the video game Guild Wars 2, as well as the Rock Band franchise, and many others. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk. As I've said to you before, I've really enjoyed your work for a long time, so I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I'm glad we can make this work.
Yeah. Well, how's life, first of all?
Well, there's an interesting, the last year has been interesting, obviously, for everyone, and that's putting it lightly. But I will say that in general, there's a certain kind of temperament that composers have, which is they're very happy being alone in a room with their thoughts for hours and hours on end.
Sure.
So while the pandemic is obviously terrible and has had, far-reaching implications and affected people very negatively, both literally, mentally, emotionally, not too much has changed for me because, I spend my days alone in a room.
Yeah.
And I am very lucky, I will say, to have had, been able to stay busy with Guild Wars 2 music. Very lucky. So, just kind of weathering the storm. I've managed to stay healthy. My family and friends have stayed healthy, and sometimes that's all you can ask for.
Yeah, no, especially these days. That's all you need to get by, really.
Yeah.
I guess kind of kicking things off, how was it that you got started in music? Was that something you had always wanted to do since you were young?
Yeah, I think, if I had to sort of drill it down, my first really musical memory, and this is not unique to me, but it's interesting how paths kind of diverge, is, begging my parents to let me pull all the pots and pans out of the cabinet and just bang on them with chopsticks. I just loved that sound. And I mean, that must have been, if I'm remembering my timeline of my own life correctly, in the house that I was in at the time, 4 years old, 5 years old at most, maybe even a little younger. And then I think the first time it was sort of clear that I had a knack for music was my sister. I remember, my parents were great parents, very supportive of both my sister and I's hobbies and interests. And they tried to encourage us and give us new things to try, like, hey, maybe he'll like this, maybe she'll like this. So they bought my sister a Casio keyboard, probably about that big, from Radio Shack, which no longer exists. And I think she, for maybe a couple months, was doing piano lessons on Saturdays or something like that at the high school or some VFW hall or something like that. And she didn't really take to it. And so the keyboard went back in the box and back in the closet. And, being the little brother Snoop, I was like, that thing seems cool. I would love to just mess around with it. And so I got it out, and I remember, checking out different presets and stuff, but it was very easy for me to pick out melodies by ear. And that wasn't something that I realized was unusual until my parents, said, hey, how did you learn that? And I was like, I don't know, I just sat down and figured it out. And they're like, what? And so that was, 6 or 7, something like that. In terms of real music, when I was, I think, I don't, this has probably changed for kids in public school in the US, at least these days, but music classes being part of the standard curriculum, I think, has been whittled away at, unfortunately. I think it's very unfortunate. But, when I was in elementary school back in the 80s and early 90s, that was still part of class, up to a certain point. And so, like every kid, we got recorders that we paid $5 for and learned how to play hot cross buns and all that kind of stuff. But then as you got a little closer to being slightly like the back half of elementary school, the sort of music teacher for the school district would come to all the different elementary schools in the area. And if you were interested in trying to be in the band, basically, your teacher would say, okay, who wants to, try out for the band? And then you get a little worksheet that had all the instruments on it and say, okay, check 3 that you are interested in playing. And it's funny how this has become kind of or at the time it was very gendered, and I'm not sure if it is now, but it probably still is, I would assume. But it's like boys want to play saxophone, they want to play drums, and they want to play, trumpet, and girls, want to play flute and violin, and, which I think is unfortunate that it gets divided that way. But I was like, yeah, saxophone, trumpet seems cool. And then the day came where the teacher comes to your school. He brings all of these instruments, and we went down to the gymnasium, and he had them all laid out, and you'd sit there one by one. You'd go up to, meet with him sit in a chair across from him. And he would say, he would pull out your worksheet and be like, okay. And he pulled out mine. And he's like, okay, I see, you've got saxophone and this and that. And he said, but let's try the clarinet. And I think when I think back about that moment now, I'm like, I bet every boy was like, I want to play saxophone. Every girl was like, I want to play flute. And he didn't have any clarinet players. So he's like, all right, I got enough of that. I'm going to see if this kid wants to play clarinet.
Yeah.
So he kind of taught me, how to wet the reed and how to make this mouth shape, which this was like 30 years ago, more. But he's like, you have to make a face like an old man. And he made this like kind of like toothless face about, the position you have to get your mouth into, on the clarinet mouthpiece. Probably not good for a podcast, for an audio medium, but it was a funny, just to make a toothless face, pretend like you took your dentures out. Anyway, he put the clarinet in my hands, and the most god awful sound came out. It was just horrendous, right? Like squealing, squeaking. So he kind of took it out of my hand, and said, "Okay, you're not a clarinet player." And then he taught me how to make this sort of buzzing sound that you need to play a trumpet. He's like, maybe this will work. So buzz in the mouthpiece. Okay, that sounds good. Oh, let's put it in the trumpet. Okay, now do the same thing. And like the first thing that came out was just a crystal clear note. And if I'm getting my transposition right, it would have been a B flat, right? It was just like boom, B flat. And he took that in mind. He goes, okay, you were born to be a trumpet player, and that was it. He didn't give me any other instruments at all. So that was like that was a real turning point that everything else kind of evolved out of. And that teacher, his name is Jeff Worster, very fundamental to all of my musical interests. I mean, he became the music teacher in my junior high school, and he remembered me being a talented trumpet player. I kind of had a natural, I hated practicing. I still hate practicing anything. But I had a natural ability, and he kind of plucked me to be in the jazz band in my junior high, which was like the sort of advanced placement for kids that were into music. And we entered into the Berklee College of Music High School Jazz Festival, which I hope they still do. They did it when I was there, at least, fast forward. And that was another big eye-opening moment of like, oh, you can like study this, and you can surround yourself with people that only think about and talk about music and make this your life. And that was when I was 12. So those two moments he was involved in, very, very closely. And I've been fortunate enough to kind of get back in touch with him recently and say, hey, man, it all worked out.
Wow.
Look what you did. Yeah.
Yeah. And you were talking about with kind of music dwindling away from public schools. Like I'm so envious of that, because I never had that kind of class when I was, growing up. And so that sounds like that could be completely as it kind of was for you, like kind of life altering, that kind of class.
It really is. I mean, I just, I understand if you're an administrator and all you see is numbers on a spreadsheet and seeing it as something frivolous. But, I, like any other creative person, will always advocate for the arts being able to unlock something in people that you can't quantify, right? You don't know it's there until you kind of give someone the opportunity. And I'm also not of the opinion that like it has to lead to a profession, right? Like this idea that, school is all about training kids for the real world and getting a job. And yes, that is the bulk of it. There's a lot of other things, and the American education system is very complicated and messy and could do with some fixing up. But, not every moment of a child's development needs to be about preparing them to like join the workforce and, all that kind of stuff. And music is just nice. It's a nice thing to have in your life. And, if you don't ever get to a point where you're doing it at a professional level or even like an advanced amateur level, you just do it because you like learning tunes on your keyboard to unwind after work. Like that is totally valid, and something that, I'm saddened that kids might be deprived of finding that out about themselves.
Yeah. No. I totally agree. And now in all of this time when you were growing up or even perhaps right before you started in composing, what was the kind of music that you listened to or that you maybe first were influenced by?
Yeah. I mean, it's ironic that the music that I do now is obviously score stuff, primarily orchestral based, at least for Guild Wars. I can do a lot of other stuff. I do have guitars on the wall, as you can see back there.
Yep.
But when I was a kid, my music taste was heavily influenced by my parents. And it's interesting because I've talked about it with them since then. My parents are very, very late boomers, early cusp of Generation X, kind of. They're born in the mid to late 50s.
Mm.
So it's sort of at the tail end of the boom sort of thing. But they were still part of that generation. There's just a massive gulf in terms of culture between their parents and them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that starting with them, I think the gap was much smaller. In fact, I remember distinctly that like my dad was the person who told me about Soundgarden. I remember him coming home from work one day and being like, "Dude, you got to check this band out, man. They're called Soundgarden. They're awesome." And I was still like super into rock, but I just hadn't gotten to the Soundgarden phase of my life yet. And it was just kind of funny that my dad, who was probably, I mean, he was probably my age now. So like 40, 30, I'm 39, but he was probably plus or minus a couple years. But, my parents, my dad listened to classic rock, but he would always say, when I was a kid, this wasn't classic rock. It was just rock. This is what was on the radio. This is what we would do. And then my mom also listened to some of that, but was more into the kind of 70s, like singer-songwriter stuff like Carole King and James Taylor's huge James Taylor fan, Paul Simon. And then between both of them, the Beatles, just always on in the house. So, that's sort of, and that's still, if I had to say like, what's your desert island music? What's the thing that someone pointed a gun at the back of your head and said, you can only listen to one era for the rest of your life? From like 1960 to 1980 is kind of my sweet spot, even though all of that happened before I was even born. But it's just the stuff that I love and I never get tired of listening to. Yeah. So, but I listen to other things sometimes.
Well, how did composing begin?
Yeah, well, so I went to Berklee College of Music eventually. And while I was there, when I was a teenager, I kind of swapped trumpet for the guitar. It just was the cooler instrument. Although I regret not playing the trumpet more. Although I will say that experience, even though it was just a elementary school and junior high school level, knowing what it's like being on the other side of a podium and being in an orchestra, it is incredibly useful in my current work. So yeah, when I was at Berklee, I was there as a guitar player, and I was convinced that I was going to be, not convinced, but my goal was to be a rock star, right? It's just that was
that's a good one to go to.
Yeah, and that's why people pick up a guitar. That's why I picked up one. When I got out of school, I spent most of my 20s joining and quitting bands and touring and doing that whole thing, living out of a van and trying not to get fired from your job or getting fired and then trying to figure out how you're going to pay your rent. And it was cool. I mean, I have all the rock and roll stories, including like playing awesome shows in cities where I don't know a single person, and the power of what music can do to bring people together. But the one thing that we didn't do was make any money. So, as I got closer to 30, I just thought, this is not the life that I want. I knew I was getting to the point where I was pretty fully ingrained in the Boston music scene at the time. And I just knew a lot of people who were 5, 10, 20 years older than me and hadn't given up on the dream. And it's a delicate balance because you don't become a rock star unless you like fully get invested in it. And your time to be called up might be later than other people, but the odds are definitely diminished as you get older. and all these guys were just so angry and so bitter and miserable. And Boston's kind of a miserable town to begin with. And I just thought, man, I don't want to cross that threshold of being the 30-plus-year-old grumpy Boston burnout, that keeps talking about that one sold out show that they had in Chicago 10 years ago. And why aren't I famous anymore?
Right.
Or now? Why didn't that make me famous? So I started thinking about plan B. And when I was in school at Berkeley, I graduated in 2003. And I'm not sure how old you are, but my guess is you're a lot younger than I am.
I'm 27.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, you would have been, you were alive, but you would have been very young. So around 2003 was like the peak of the sort of first wave of MP3s and Napster and downloading, and the fear over what that was going to do to the music industry, which all turned out to be completely true.
Yeah.
All of my teachers that were worried about that, and the visiting like record company executives that were just talking about, like, there was like palpable fear sometimes in their voice when they would talk about what was happening to the music industry, and they were all right. So it seemed like a period of doom and gloom was kind of setting into the pop world. And I remember very specifically reading articles as I was getting out of school that would say things like video game sales outgross movie and CD sales combined for the year. And this was almost 20 years ago. And I thought, well, if one line on the graph is trending this way and the other one's trending this way, then why don't I follow the one that's trending upward, And so I had that idea, like, I like video games. Video games are cool. Oh, that's a job. If there's music in it, somebody's got to write that music. Well, I can write music. I wonder if I can do that for games. But I put it on the back burner because when you're 20, you should try to be a rock star. Just that's the age to try it.
Yeah.
As I got closer to 30, I thought, well, that video game thing seems cool again. And, this is where sort of luck comes into play. At the time, I was really done with bands, and I quit what had been the most successful band in terms of touring and feeling like we were building towards something. I ended up leaving that band because I just thought it was not an ideal situation. And I was at the end of my course with that one. But members of that band were in the video game industry in Boston. So in the mid to late 2000s, Boston seemed like it was kind of ascending as this video game hub for the East Coast. There's, it's interesting how these big cities out there, New York and Boston, just never really developed that sort of that part of the entertainment industry. That just like it's like a black hole. Like New York has almost nothing. I think there's a couple now, but back then there was nothing. And Boston had a few that were mildly successful, but that were kind of on the rise. And one of them was Harmonix Music Systems, which was, had been around since the late 90s, but had massive success now. They're a few years into their success with the Guitar Hero and Rock Band franchises.
Right.
So a couple of the guys in this band worked at Harmonix, including one that I was particularly close with, and he was one of the founders of this band. And so it's like I quit his band, and then like a week later he said, "Hey man, we're hiring in Harmonix, in the audio department. So if you want, I can pass along your resume." And he and I had known each other for several years at that point, and he had known that I'd been interested in games. And before he got to Harmonix, he was at a different studio that closed down, but he invited me to come in and hang out for a day with the audio director there. And I was trying to work my way in somehow. And this was like peak Rock Band years. So This was 2008 when I first got that job. And Rock Band 1 had already come out, and they were working on 2, and just things were, continuing to be massively successful. So they were staffing up like crazy. And I'm giving a very long answer to your question.
No, you're fine.
I'll get to the point. So I got that job, and that to me was like I was so grateful because being in bands was cool. I love being in bands. It was I loved most of it. But, when I wasn't playing or we weren't touring, I had just a crappy day job. I had an office job that I was comfortable and I was able to pay my rent, but I was miserable.
Mm-hmm.
If I didn't shave every day, my boss would be like, it'd be great if you could, just clean up a little bit more before you come in. I'm like, I can't shave every day, man. I'm going to come with like a bloody face.
Yeah.
So anyway, so yeah, I got that job and I thought it wasn't actually as a composer. It's funny because our titles were sound designer / composer, and we didn't do either of those things for the most part. The majority of the audio department back then was just about transcribing music and turning it into those like colored lanes that come at you on the screen. And they wanted people who were musicals that were tech savvy enough. You didn't have to really have you didn't have to have any experience in the game. A lot of us, this was our first break in the game industry, many people. But for that particular job, it was more important to know what it felt like to play the real instrument so that you could translate it to the fake version and have it feel as close as possible. So yeah, no music writing. You're listening to other people's music every day, and then certainly no sound design. People who are more senior got to do some of the sound design, but that game is all about kind of making it feel. It's not very sound effecty. It's all like guitar chunks and hitting drums and stuff. And I was too junior. We didn't get to do any of that. So I was there for about 2 years, and I thought, this is great. This will be my career. I'll be a sound designer for games, and it uses enough of my skill set. There's musical aspects to doing sound design that I thought this will be fine, and I'll be happy doing this. But then after about 2 years of that, I got so sick of living in Boston. I've been there for 11 years at that point, and I was just like, man, I'm not cut out for this anymore. I don't like this place. So I started applying to jobs all over the world just as a sound designer. And the first place you apply, you're like, cool, Activision. I want to work on Call of Duty. And if I was the hiring manager at Activision now, and a resume for someone who barely worked for 2 years on music games came across my desk, and be like, okay, next. But I was ambitious. I was like, yeah, I'm in the game industry now. They'll totally hire me. And that didn't work out that way. So I started trying to look for the less obvious companies to apply to. And I applied to ArenaNet. And that's not a slight against them. They're a very successful and long running company, but I was not an MMO player. So they weren't kind of forefront in my mind of places to look. Although I had heard of Guild Wars. I applied there again for a job that was way too senior for me. But then while they had my resume, another position opened up that was junior, that was perfect. So I got the job there. I moved to Seattle in 2010 and was continuing to do sound design. Very happy doing sound design. And after about a year and a half of being there, the game was going to launch. They were preparing for the launch of the game in 2012. And the relationship with the previous composer had kind of broken down. They wanted to bring somebody in-house and look for somebody new, right? Look for somebody fresh. And so my boss, the audio director at the time, came to me and said, "Hey, you're like the music guy. Can you put together a list of people that we can reach out to and talk about music for the game coming up? Because MMOs just constantly need music. It's not like it ships and then you're done." And so I said, yeah, sure. And I, in earnest, started putting together a list. And then I had this kind of a light bulb over the head moment where I thought, this is opportunity probably knocking as loud as it will ever knock in my entire life. And if I don't at least ask him if I can do the music, I'm gonna regret it because I don't know if I'll ever get a chance like this again. So I went to him and said, "Hey, look, I'll find a composer if you want one. I think that won't be a problem, but let me make the case for letting me do it." And I had to convince him, that I could do it because I was like, the music, obviously in Guild Wars 1 and what shipped with Guild Wars 2 in 2012 was beautiful, grand, lush, or full orchestra, sounds like a movie score. And I didn't study film scoring at all when I was in school. I took a very basic intro level class that didn't get into any actual music composition, and then kind of decided it wasn't for me, ironically. And then, so I have musical training, but not the right particular type of training for this type of work. And so I said, look, I don't have a demo reel that I can play you. I don't have anything to prove to you that I can sit down and write for an orchestra on the level that is already in the game, right? It's not just can you do it, but can it be as good as what's already there? Because they have to sit side by side. But I said, the advantages of hiring me to do it are I know this game intimately now. I've been here for a couple of years. I know the team that makes this game better than any sort of hired gun would. I know the tool set we use, which is very specific and all proprietary to the studio. And, like you've got to trust me on the creative side, but I have all these other advantages. And I know that I can write this kind of music because I can hear it up here. Like this type of music is in my head. Just give me some time to figure out the mechanics of getting it out of my head. And, I'll do my best. So they bought me some sample libraries to work with, and I had to spend months. It was about 3 months where I was staying late every night, coming in every weekend, just trying to learn the tools, because that's a whole separate skill set that I didn't even realize at the time. There's like how to write for orchestra, like what do violins do? Oh, okay. What combinations sound the best, and how do you voice chords and stuff that. You spend a lifetime learning that stuff. 3 months is you haven't even scratched the surface. But then there's also the other side of like, how do I produce mock-ups and fully, sample library based tracks that are convincing enough, to fool people that a real orchestra is playing it. And that is also a lifetime commitment, because new stuff is coming out all the time, and you kind of have to keep your chops up. So anyway, after about 3 months, I finally gave him some music that I was happy with, that I listen to now, and I'm like, yikes! I would not have hired me if this was what they sent me. But I think the essence of the music is good. It's not produced very well, and I had a chance to re-record it live a few years later, which was great, and fix some of my mistakes. But it was good enough that it came out with the kind of annual Halloween. Every year they do a Halloween festival in the game, and it was kind of a quirky Danny Elfman sort of piece, and people loved it, and people still love it. And that was 9 years ago now, and that was kind of how it kicked off, and here I am.
Yeah, but I mean, it seems like you went in, kind of jumped in the deep end, but it seemed to work out for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. I'm not super risk taker type of person, but it depends on the circumstance. Like, I just had enough. It's like at that point, I've been doing music for so long. It's like, yeah, I'm a musician. So, and I'm not just a guitar player. I had this kind of moment while I was at Berklee where, Berklee is a pretty small school, and there was about 3,000 people there when I was there, students. And 1,000 of them, 1/3 of the entire population of the school, were guitar players, which is crazy because every guitar player that's there was the hotshot in their hometown. But then you get there, and all of a sudden, it's the classic like big fish, small pond, small fish, big pond flip, and I was pretty good. Like I'm a good guitar player, but I had this kind of moment where I was like, even if I get over my hatred of practicing and sit down and practice 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, and become the best guitar player I could possibly be, there is still likely to be 100 guitar players at the school that are better than me. And there are kids at Berklee that get caught up in that rat race of trying to be the best at their thing. And, if you're the one harp player there, because there was like one harp player when I was there might've been two actually, but then it's a lot easier to be the best. But if you're one of 1,000, I don't know. It just wasn't what motivated me to make music. And it's still not. Like, I like being kind of good at a lot of different things, so that when I have to make something, I can just go over there and play this a little bit, and then go over there and play this a little bit, and just figure it out. And this idea of being a complete musician and not just a player, like there's a need for that, but that wasn't what I felt like my path was. And so when it came time to say, are you ready to write music for an orchestra, of which you've only ever played one instrument that's traditionally in the orchestra, and the last time you touched it was 20 years ago. I just thought, like, I know how to do this. I can figure it out. Just give me the time and the resources. And I'm very grateful that ArenaNet did, because, that moment changed my life.
Yeah. No, I mean, I guess I'm kind of similar with podcasting. Like, I mean, it's great for for someone to be amazing at one thing, and that can be very useful and very respectable. But also, I also am kind of similar where I kind of like to learn a variety of things, and so I can do it myself, or at least I have the information to do so. Yeah.
And I think that kind of like curiosity and thirst for learning new things, acquiring new skills is that's a fun way to get through life. Otherwise it's pretty dull and miserable, right? It's like there's so much bad in the world that counteracting it with something that like motivates you to get excited about, waking up in the morning and getting out of bed is, I can't imagine living life any other way.
Yeah. Well, now with something like Guild Wars 2, which has, it's such a big world and there's so many different, races and characters, and like, is there something about that game that excites you the most? Maybe when you first got onto the project, or something now that you love learning more about or seeing what happens next?
Yeah. The thing that has always captivated me and inspires me still to this day is just how beautiful that world is. Mm-hmm. A lot of these people have kind of cycled out because the company's been around for a while and people shift and priorities change. But the foundation of the art style for that game is from a master illustrator and painter named Daniel Dociu, Dociu. And I encourage anyone to go look up his art. You'll recognize it immediately. But he's like literally a master. And he has this amazing story. He's Romanian. I'm probably going to butcher the details, so I won't give too many details, but
it's all good.
He's Romanian, and he escaped Romania when it was still a communist country, I think, with his children. I only know some of the details, so I don't want to get it wrong, but he basically had like a heroic escape with his family from Romania to come to the US, and, just carried by his like inarguable talent. He's won all sorts of massive awards, like some of the biggest awards for fantasy illustration and stuff. So getting him on the original Guild Wars was a big win for the studio. And he was there until, I feel like he was there until maybe 2015 or 2016. So he put in about 15 years at ArenaNet, and he established, like he handpicked all of his artists, many of whom are still there. I think his sort of the first round of people that he mentored or have kind of moved up into his role. But he's very particular about what he likes and what he doesn't like and what he thinks is good. And he made sure that everybody that he hired or that joined the art team were the best of the best. And that, even though he's not there and hasn't been for a while, that sort of ethos is still very much a pillar of what makes Guild Wars and ArenaNet as a company, that defines the games that they make. And so I could look at that stuff all day. It's crazy. When I used to work in the office, because I moved away from Seattle in 2015 and just been working remotely. But the 5 years that I was in the office, so you're surrounded by art, which is amazing. And so you walk by these beautiful printouts of paintings and stuff. And then, you're in the kitchen, you're making coffee, and you're making small chat or small talk with somebody who's like waiting for you to get done so they can make their cup of coffee or whatever. And then, I would just think of them as coworkers. Like, I don't work in a department, but they're a familiar face. So you say, hi, how are you? And then I would have these epiphanies as I'm doing research, trying to get inspired for some new track, and look at some piece of concept art and be like, holy shit, that's so-and-so did that? And you're like, they're just this normal, nice person that I say hi to and I'm getting coffee. And like, oh my God, they're actually a genius, So I'm still blown away by that. I if I could sort of turn the dial back and change paths, in a fantasy version of my own life, I would love to be able to sit down at, just with a pencil and paper, let alone a, digital setup or a palette full of paint. But I'm truly in awe of what these people do. And so I would love to be able to do that. So yeah, still, I mean, the game is a little old, obviously, in terms of visuals. It's not the most cutting edge. And yet it's still miraculous how they are able to translate the concept art into something an in-game asset and retain the grandeur and the beauty of it and continue to find new ways to push it. I don't know. I'm always just, like I said, in awe of that side of the game.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought that up, because I actually saw like some of the concept art before I had played the game, and I was like, I have to play this game.
Yeah.
Just as you were saying, it was incredible, and not only with that art, but just with I think with video games in general, I'm always blown away by not only the animation within the game, but like the concept art is unbelievable. I just I can't imagine how that could come out of someone's head, you know?
Yeah, I can't either. And I don't know. It's to me, it's one of the coolest parts of being in the industry is, I mean, there's some of the, I even have friends that some that worked at ArenaNet that hop back and forth between movie productions and stuff, but you so rarely get to see that as just a straight up consumer. Whereas I feel like because, games have to be built from the ground up, they really try to push the art. Like it's a visual art form, but unlike movies where you just, have concepts, but then you got to hire actors and build sets and light it. And then that's what you want people to focus on. You're trying to translate these amazing concept pieces into the real thing. And I don't know, I'm probably not putting in the right terms, but to me, maybe it's because I'm in the middle of it, but game art feels like it's pushed much more to the forefront than it is in movies.
Yeah, I agree. And now with this game that since it is so big, is it difficult to try and keep the music fairly cohesive with so many different, I guess, threads going out? Or is it so big that you don't have to worry about everything fitting together and it's just you can kind of go off in your own different avenues of styles?
Yeah, it's a blurry line. Because the first few years I was writing music, I was so concerned with making sure that it felt like Guild Wars music. And I still try to make that, the sort of number one priority. But my idea of Guild Wars music was everything that had come before. But now I've sort of gotten to a point where I've established enough of a body of work that I can decide if I'm, referencing myself or referencing the previous music, or if it's time to stretch. Like I have such a fundamental understanding of what the music for the game is that I know when it can push and pull a little bit. And I've also been in a situation where I've had to outsource some stuff to other composers. And then again, you have to be this sort of beacon to be like, yes, that's Guild Wars. No, that's not Guild Wars. And it's tricky. And I don't like putting clamps on people's creativity. So I try to let people have leeway and let their voice come out. So yeah, I don't know. There's really no good answer to it. I've had moments where I put stuff in the game where I'm like, man, they're not going to go for this. This is way too out there. And then it turns into a really popular track. Like there was a track on the Heart of Thorns soundtrack called Radasum, which is in the game, for people who haven't played it that might be listening. There's a race of people and creatures in the game called the Asura. Mm-hmm. And they are these little sort of Yoda-looking creatures who their lore is that they've developed science. They've evolved their ability to, do science, for lack of a better term, to a point where it's indistinguishable from magic, right? It's essentially magic, the way they've kind of applied science to their culture and civilization. And so there's a little bit of room there to do interesting stuff with like synthesizers, stuff that you wouldn't normally associate with a fantasy setting. But this particular area in the game, Radasum, is this like lost city underground. It's a fragment of their civilization that got stuck in this underground city for thousands of years and died out. And the only thing that's left are these giant automatons that they kind of create to do all their dirty work, that are kind of roaming around still doing their job. And I thought, well, what does this sound like? The idea of like a vast empty city means, it's got to be big, expansive, tons of reverb. And I really like the idea of musically trying to replicate, like you clapping your hands or saying echo and hearing it just bounce around, for 10 seconds. And then this idea that they're this scientific society and that the only thing that's left of these machines means, repetitive figures and phrases, rhythmic sort of pulses and stuff like that. So I put all that in there, and I thought this is like a sci-fi track to me. It doesn't sound like a Guild Wars track, but it has strings in it. That's close enough to the rest of the soundtrack. So maybe that's like the link on the Venn diagram. It's the little sliver where they overlap. And I thought it was going to be too out there, and I put it it was shipped in the game, and it's like people still talk about how much they love that one track in particular. And it also is very different than anything else on the Heart of Thorn. Not only Guild Wars, but the entirety of the Heart of Thorn soundtrack. It's very, very different. But that was kind of the first crack where I was like, oh, maybe I can get a little weird, to me, what I think of as weird. So, there's been a few other instances. There's even like a couple years ago, I did this thing that has some chiptune stuff in it. Not that there's like sort of some exclusively chiptune music for a special event that replicates retro video games, but there's like an orchestral chiptune hybrid track that's like one of my favorites. And, I maybe some people go out and find it now and listen to it now that I've mentioned it. Yeah. So yeah, it's weird. There is kind of a path, but every once in a while you can break off of it.
Mm-hmm. And one of my favorites is The Jungle Provides.
Oh yeah.
And I think one thing across all the games that it almost just seems like a natural kind of ability. But one thing I noticed right off the bat is even though there are times where the music is really epic and serious, it somehow feels very light on its feet. And it flows very well.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, my general philosophy that people in meetings with me, I'm sure sick of hearing about it, but like, I'm not an epic music guy. I don't particularly like listening to that kind of music, at least out of context. If it's in a movie that has it, then great. But it's just not my favorite version of contemporary, scores, which means I don't like writing it. So I try not to. I like pretty stuff. I like, delicate things, and I like woodwinds, and I like chords that have major sevenths in them. And you know what I mean? I like nice stuff. I like pretty melodies, and I like plucky harps and celestes and that kind of thing. So I've been lucky enough to avoid falling into that trap of having to have everything just have 3,000 brass players and, a million taiko drums. It's a necessary evil, and I have to do it sometimes. But I prefer not to. So and that's actually one of the things I love about working on Guild Wars is that most of the time you don't need it. I mean, you always need sort of combat music because you're always getting in fights. Although lately, I have been kind of farming that out to other people who I think are better and faster at it. But in general, the game is beautiful, and so the music should be beautiful, and that's where I feel like it's kind of the perfect marriage.
Mm-hmm. And now on the note of composers, either when you were first getting into music or perhaps anything recently, are there any composers that stand out to you as either having been influenced you to become a composer, or perhaps just ones that you enjoy having in movies or TV shows or whatever it may be?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, my answers are probably not, groundbreaking or revolutionary, but, obviously John Williams is a huge one. Sure. I was just such a massive Star Wars fan as a kid. I was kind of this perfect age when Star Wars had its renaissance that it's still riding to this day. But like, in the late 80s, early 90s, there wasn't much going on in the Star Wars world. And then when I was 14 or so is when they started bringing the action figures back, is when the books started to come out and video games. And it was just like heaven for a dorky kid. Mm-hmm. So I had listened to the soundtracks like endlessly, and I still do all the time. It's like one of the few things I never get sick of listening to. Mm-hmm. But I also remember when I was a kid discovering my dad. It's funny, I got a lot of music taste from my dad, but there was something that happened between the transition from listening to music on vinyl to listening to music on CD, where my dad's taste changed. Mm. And so in the 90s, all the CDs he bought, it was like all smooth jazz. I don't understand why. He would be listening to this stuff, and I'm like, what's the appeal here? Even back then when I was a kid, I'm like, this is pretty bad, Dad. Mm. So he would have hundreds of CDs of just like, I don't want to trash talk, in case anybody has some favorite 90s era smooth jazz bands that might be listening. But I would dig through his CDs just trying to find new stuff to listen to. And I came across an album of Aaron Copland's. I don't want to say it's a greatest hits, but it kind of is a greatest hits. It was put up by Sony Classics. I think it's like sort of it's one of those ones that if you're mildly interested in his music, you probably have this one, or at least it was the gateway if you're a casual Copland fan. But I would listen to that all the time. I was so amazed that somebody could write. Like I knew about movie scores and soundtracks and things, but he was the first person I think I attached like, oh, you can do this just for the sake of doing it, and be able to tell a story, right? Like even now, I'm not crazy about Bach and classical stuff. I mean, I like some of that stuff, and musically I appreciate it, but I don't find myself wanting to listen to it. And I also hate piano concertos. I hate them. I've sort of cautiously admitted that before, but I don't like listening to the piano in that context. And I don't know. That's a weird sort of side.
No, I mean that's understandable.
Yeah, it's just too noodly. I don't know. It's like it's not for me. But so this sort of the rigid structure and form of a lot of that music, pre-romantic era music is just, it's fine. It just doesn't do much for me. But yeah, Copeland, it just like fully resonated with me. And still, I mean, I love his harmonies. I love when he chooses to go way out there and then just come up with the prettiest tune you've ever heard in your life. So those are two sort of fundamental ones when I was a kid. I think as an adult, I've come to really appreciate Jerry Goldsmith a lot more, and realize that even though I didn't realize it at the time, and even in the last 10 years as I've been working harder to get better at this, I didn't realize how much more of a Jerry Goldsmith I am than a John Williams.
Sure.
Not that I'm even in the same ballpark as either of them, but in terms of like what they prioritize and how they, orchestrate things, and Jerry's like no frills, beautiful tune, simple accompaniment, keeps it interesting. But John Williams is like, a musical doily. Like it's just all amazingly intricate and perfectly orchestrated, perfectly voiced, and never does anything more than twice. And it modulates, and it's so complex that like you just can't aspire to that. I can't. Others can and have done a great job. But I just know that kind of like my epiphany about being a guitar player versus a well-rounded musician at Berklee, I realized that I should stop trying to chase the John Williams thing and maybe lean more into the Jerry Goldsmith. And then lately I've been crazy into James Newton Howard.
Oh yeah, he's great.
Yeah, I think he's underappreciated. I mean, he obviously works on huge projects and writes amazing music, but he's been doing it for so long. And he's just as good as any of those guys. He's awesome. I mean, the Waterworld soundtrack, is like one of my absolute favorites. I'm in love with that soundtrack. And also his soundtrack for the first Maleficent movie, the remake that came out a few years, just like unbelievable stuff. Yeah. So I would love if he was he is in that echelon for people that know, but I would just, I want to champion him. To me, he belongs on the Mount Rushmore.
Yeah. No, with James Newton Howard, one that I loved that he did recently that it kind of went under the radar was Red Sparrow with Jennifer Lawrence. That was a really cool one. Yeah.
I haven't listened, but I'll check it out.
Yeah. But no, and I love Jerry Goldsmith as well, but with like John Williams, as you were saying, and he keeps on producing things. It's like, it's just, as you were saying, it's like the complexity is just unbelievable. I just every time there's a new, whether it's, Star Wars or whatever it may be, it's like, how does that happen? It's almost aggravating how much he can do.
He's just the best, he's the Michael Jordan of it. And it's just like, some people are just better at it than others. And that's not to discount the work that he's put in, but in terms of, in the race of being a great composer, he started one lap ahead of the rest of us, and well-deserved. I mean, I'm in awe of his abilities and still actually find new things. I listen to Star Wars a lot, and Harry Potter I love, and Superman stuff, like all the sort of classics. Mm-hmm. But I found myself trying to find new, undiscovered John Williams stuff for me. And like a few years ago, I finally listened. I've never even seen the movie, but I guess I should change that. But the Memoirs of a Geisha soundtrack, is like so cool and so different. That's the other thing, is that you hear it and you're like, this is John Williams, but it's not. He doesn't repeat himself in the same way. It's like it's distinctly him and also distinctly different than anything else he's done. And that soundtrack is just gorgeous. One of his most beautiful. In a career that's littered with beautiful soundtracks, that one is one of his prettiest, I think.
Yeah. No, totally. And I love his work with Spielberg as well. Like and they've done so many projects together and yeah, he's amazing. I mean, we could talk about him for hours, but
yeah.
um, I guess it's kind of maybe a cheesy question or kind of broad. And so if there's not a specific answer, that's okay. Would you have any either advice or something for either someone who's wanting to be a composer or perhaps something that not enough people know about composers that they should know about the work process and obviously, and again, I know that's a big kind of a broad question, but I was just curious.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I've never been asked that particular question. You get a lot of like, how do I break into the game industry, which is also an impossible question to answer, but I've tried a few more times. I don't know. I would say that it's a combination of two things, which is trusting your gut. Not that you can do it. I mean, that was sort of my initial impetus, but like when you have an idea, just on a purely creative level, the blank page is the most intimidating thing, right? Mm-hmm. Especially when the clock is ticking. But all it takes is the simplest idea. Like today, I'm going to start working on this after I finish this and get some lunch. But I was like, I gotta write something today. I'm a little behind on some stuff. And I'm like, and just the thought of that, I have to do something today. I haven't started it yet is very intimidating.
Yeah.
Then I remembered that when I was finishing up the last thing I was doing last week, this happens a lot, and I should probably double check all of my old sessions because I'll bet it's littered with these kinds of things. I'll get an idea for something. I'll be like, oh shit, I got to remember that. And so I'll like zoom way ahead in the session, just hit record and noodle around and be like, cool, I'm going to come back to that. Mm-hmm. And then it'll be like off the screen. So I forget that it's there. But today I was like, I gotta start this new thing. I'm like, oh yeah, I have that idea from last week that's just sitting, 10 minutes out on the last session that I just finished. So just that peace of mind of knowing that like, there's an idea, great, the door is open, and I can figure it out from there. Not discounting the part of that, sort of part two of that answer is like, not discounting the hard work that it takes and the time. And like, do I wish I was faster? Absolutely. Does it seem frustrating to work a week on, 90 seconds of music or two minutes of music? Sometimes, not all the time. Sometimes you get that in a day or more. But it's like, damn, it only took 2 minutes to listen to this thing that I've been killing myself over for a week, But it really is just about the work. So you have that idea, great. Ideas are a dime a dozen. I could come up with an idea right now. But then you have to sit down and apply the craft to it, which takes practice and study and just stick with it. Like, the process is messy and, my stuff sounds terrible until it sounds great. And I think there might be a misconception of the like genius. We've all seen Amadeus and seen him like lean over his pool table, like shoving the billiard ball around as he writes his next like masterpiece. Mm-hmm. And you can't, even he had to sit there and work. And that obviously is a movie, like fantasy version of what his life was probably like. And also different circumstances, right? Like composers up until 20 years ago had to be really well versed in developing their musical imagination as thoroughly as possible because it wasn't possible to produce realistic sounding anything on a computer, So you had to be like John Williams. You had to be a great piano player or at least competent enough and sit down with pencil and paper. And, in Mozart's day, you had to have someone in your town recognize your talent, ship you off to Vienna, and then see if you can get, tutored by the old master who was taught by the previous master, who was taught by the previous master, just so that the knowledge didn't die out. And it's like, we live in a different era. So, not judging yourself against the great geniuses or even your favorite music that you think, how on earth did they come up with this is important. And knowing that even the best person has to sit down and put in the work and apply less creative sides of things that's just strictly craft, to an idea. And then, so that's that's two parts of one answer. And then, what was the other thing I was going to say? Ideas and applying craft. Oh, and finding your voice, right? This is something, this is not like a unique thought, but like I just said about John Williams and Jerry Goldsmith, it's actually taken me this long into my life and career to realize that the thing that comes more naturally to me is more on the Jerry Goldsmith spectrum. And I still have a long way to go to get as good as he is in terms of his level of craft. But mentally realizing that I don't need to try to climb the impossible hill. There's a hill that I'm capable of climbing that is still challenging, but is not like the sheer face of, this isn't like free solo. Like I can hike up this, mountain. I don't have to be dangling from my fingertips from a completely vertical rock face over here. And so recognizing what your strengths are and the things that the thing, again, tie it back into what I said earlier, the things that motivate you to do the thing that you love, that's there for a reason. So follow that, I would love it if I never had to work to do any sort of overtly actiony music or, work on like a horror movie. I just, those kinds of things are just not interesting to me. And, if that's the only job I can find, then so be it. But I've been lucky enough to avoid it because I've only pursued the things that truly motivate me to make music. And so I think it's important to look inwards and find that out about yourself.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. Well, Maclaine, it's really nice talking to you. Is there anything else in particular that I haven't brought up or anything upcoming that you'd like to have known, or have we touched on some of all the major points?
We've certainly covered a lot of Guild Wars stuff and a lot of my life. I can't unfortunately talk about other things. It's just the way it goes. There's other things coming this year that are, potentially not Guild Wars related. But I can't say anything else other than that. But last year was a tough year for a lot of people, and it was sort of like the world just went on pause, and this year's already shaping up to be a little bit better, and I'm excited about that. So if you like my music, and I hope you do, there's more coming.
Oh, cool. Well, good. All right. Thank you again. It's been really nice talking to you, and I hope to, with another project down the line, would love to get you back on sometime.
Sure. Anytime.
Thank you. All right, everybody. I think that is about it for the show this week. Please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe on your way out. Thank you so much. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Music Buds. Check out themusicbuds.com. And we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did, and we'll see you next time.